Chapter 17, Evolution. So if we look at the history of evolution, we're going to talk about two individuals and their ideas. We're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle, which is about the same time frame. Both were brought up with Judeo-Christian teaching, and what primarily Plato expresses ideas in that there were imperfections. So variations among species where imperfections were put there in order to distract the observer. Now, Aristotle was more on the scala naturae, which basically stated that organisms can be arranged from simple to complex, which reflects their order in creation. So, for instance, a bacterial cell was created first before a bird, because a bird is obviously more complex than a bacterial cell. And since humans, very egocentric we are here, humans are the most complex species on our planet, that we were created last. So if we move forward in time, we're going to go to the 1700s, and we're going to talk about two scientists. They were considered naturalists. A naturalist is kind of like an ecologist, so they're going to be looking at plants and animals versus like medicine. And Buffon, he specifically concentrated on descent with modification. What is meant by descent with modification is that we kind of study species and how they have changed over time. He was very undecided on evolution, so he could see these fossils and he could see how these particular lines of organisms, like you would look at the horse lineage or even fish and amphibians, and you can see how they did change over time, but he still was not convinced about the term and what evolution exactly meant. Linnaeus, on the other hand, he focused on identification. So he was more geared in that if he was talking about a specific type of mushroom, he wanted to make sure that the other scientist he was communicating with was also talking about the same type of mushroom. So he was very focused on this naming system, this two-part naming system, which we refer to today as like the genus species. So when we went back to our taxonomy, when we did our kingdom, our King Philip came over for good sport, that good sport or GS was genus species. That's the exact name that one particular species has. So another famous naturalist was Erasmus Darwin. Now you've heard of Darwin as Charles Darwin. Erasmus is Charles Darwin's grandfather. So he was a naturalist and a physician. So he was both. This family line came from a long line of medical doctors. And what he did was he looked at an organism's embryonic development and suggested that common descent. So what we were seeing there is that species are related from a common ancestor, and he also noted this thing called vestigial organs, which were organs that was once used by a past ancestor that is no longer functional. So again, why would the body continue to produce that structure if it's just a waste of resources and energy if you're not using it anymore? Kind of like the use it or lose it idea in sports. So, but this is not a matter of, okay, I am not going to use this body part, so it's going to disappear. This is something that happens slowly over time. So here are some views we're going to look at that are pre and post Darwin. So again, this is Charles Darwin we're referring to here, not Erasmus. But before Darwin, they believed that the earth was young, only thousands of years old. What we have now found is that we have used different methods to measure the age of the earth, and we now know that it is billions of years old. It was once thought that each species was created and it did not change. And now we know that species are actually related by descent. And so that one's right here. So that would be that descent with modification. And then we know that adaptation. So if something changes, we believe that it was because of the work of the creator. So if the environment changed, the creator then had to modify his design. And now we know that adaptation to the environment is due to random variations and environmental changes. So we know that basically there's variations amongst a population, and when the environment changes, those with the adaptations to survive, and the ones that don't die. And the last thing we hear are observations substantiate the prevailing world view. So again, this is like going with the public, I guess you could say the public consensus. So, this is what the public wants, this is what the public says, and this is what we're going to stick with, versus this is scientific. So these are observations, and we have tested those hypotheses using scientific method. So these are not just viewpoints of people's opinions. These are actually I don't want to say substantiated, but they are actually proven by using scientific method. So a little bit about Darwin. He was the son of a wealthy physician and followed his father's footsteps into medical school. He then went into the clergy, where he furthered his studies and found little interest in medicine or religion. So those two areas didn't really interest him very much. So he did happen to find a friend by the name of John Henslow, and John Henslow was a naturalist, and so Darwin did find quite a bit of interest in natural history. So during the time of Charles Darwin in 1809 and 1882, Henslow actually came upon this opportunity and suggested that Darwin take it, and that he was hired as a science officer on the HMS Beagle, and he traveled the world for 5 years. On his journey, he made many observations and collected thousands of specimens, which he sent back to England, and he spent 20 years or more studying those specimens. So literally he would ship these specimens back to England, and they had just a huge warehouse full of all these things that he had sent from his travels. And then once he got back, he had to sort through it all, categorize it all, and he studied them. So we have a lot of information from Darwin's trip. When we look at the late 18th century, we have George Cuvier, and he actually studied living organisms and compared their anatomy. He's a very distinguished zoologist, and he actually founded the science of paleontology. He was a creationist who struggled against his findings in the sedimentary rock layers, which supported descent with modification. So, in order to try to, I don't want to say meet himself in the middle, because, again, he was a creationist, but his research was not supporting that idea, he came up with this idea called catastrophism. So catastrophism is where local catastrophes would occur. And then after that catastrophe, new organisms would inhabit the area. So this would be extended to large-scale extinctions and massive catastrophes by God, like the flood. So once this catastrophe occurred, God would then create new organisms. And of course, the idea is that he would improve on the design in which he had previous to that disaster. The next scientist we're going to talk about is Lamarck. Now, he was the first biologist to actually acknowledge evolution. He stated that animals go from simple to complex by a natural force, and that natural force was this desire for perfection. He is really famous for his inheritance of acquired characteristics, and his favorite example, or the most common example to discuss on this topic, is giraffes. We haven't had any support by experimentation of this inheritance of acquired characteristics. So here's the giraffe example. So when we look at the skeletal structures of giraffes, we know that over time the necks have gotten longer with time. Now, if you think about this, in a population, we're going to have a variety of neck lengths in giraffes. And if the trees that have the food, the branches are up higher, those giraffes with a longer neck would be more successful. They would be able to get food and then have more offspring, which of course would resemble the parents having long necks. That's not what Lamarck is stating here. What Lamarck's idea of acquired characteristics is that this giraffe right here keeps stretching his neck in order to reach the higher branches, and eventually his neck is very long. So I guess if you keep reaching to the sky every morning to get taller, eventually you will be. So we know this is not true. And then to carry this a little bit further, now he's saying this is an acquired characteristic, and that when this giraffe, who has just stretched its neck, has babies, those babies will have long necks. So we know this is not true. You could always think of it like the gauges in the ears. You guys know that you start off with a small gauge and it gets bigger and bigger and you end up with this huge hole in your earlobe, which personally I think is really disgusting. But does that mean that when you have a child, it's going to be born with huge holes in his earlobes? No. So this is a theory gone, I don't want to say bad, but it is a bad theory. So it has been busted. But we do still talk about this when we kind of re-explore how we got to where we are today in our theory of evolution. So when we talk about Darwin's theory of evolution, on his trip, Darwin actually took a book by Charles Lyell called The Principles of Geology. In this book, Lyell supports the theory of James Hutton that the Earth was subject to slow, continuous cycles. Lyell later states that the planet is very old and is constantly changing slowly, and he calls this theory uniformitarianism. So if you remember, we had talked about how pre-Darwin they thought that the planet was only a few thousand years old, but the geologists are seeing structures. I mean, look at the Grand Canyon, and they're saying it took millions of years for water to carve out that Grand Canyon. So we're saying the Earth is changing very, very slowly over time. And again, Lyell calls this uniformitarianism. So like I said, with the whole idea of Lyell and uniformitarianism, now he stated that the Earth is slowly changing. These changes can be explained by erosion and other natural phenomena. This is the geologist's explanation for today's appearance of the Earth, with the understanding that change is not uniform. So we know we have periods, like for instance with Hurricane Katrina, the devastation that it had on the shoreline was actually pretty rapid. But then it may not do anything for hundreds of thousands of years. So we do have these periods where we might have a rapid change, maybe a volcano or an earthquake, a huge earthquake. But in general, the Earth is changing slowly. So again, I already kind of talked about the Grand Canyon. So here's the pictures of the Grand Canyon. And we know, like I said, that there was a river that runs through it. That's the Colorado River. And we know that it is slowly eroding out the Grand Canyon. But again, it took a long time for this to occur. So uniformitarianism, it allowed Darwin to question the possibility of descent with modification, which is also a very slow process. So the evolution versus creationism question. So at this point, many scientists were starting to question creationism. Although there were hundreds of fossil examples demonstrating descent with modification, and we were using the word, a common ancestor, there was still not a mechanism for evolution. So we had all this proof. We could see how organisms changed over time, but how did they change over time? And this is what prevented the theory from getting the scientific support. So we couldn't tie this together as to how. Kind of like plate tectonics, we all can see that the continents they fit together into one huge supercontinent that we commonly know as Pangaea. But the idea that those huge continents actually move was almost laughable when Alfred Wegener had proposed that theory. The problem was he didn't have a mechanism for it. Okay, how do you move these super huge continents? So that's kind of where we were with evolution. We see all of these things, but we didn't have the how did these organisms change with time. Now, during Darwin's visit to Chile, he had actually experienced an earthquake, and this earthquake was pretty sizable in that it lifted an area in the harbor 3.3 feet. This then was kind of like an epiphany for Darwin in that when looking at the mountains that surrounded that cove or the harbor where they were docked, up on the top of the mountains he found marine fossils like shells and stuff, and the question was, how did the shells get up to the top of the mountain? So that was a big question that he had, and with that uplifting, with that ground being lifted up 3.3 feet, it then kind of opened up his eyes to the fact that mountains were constantly being uplifted by forces that, of course, we cannot see, but forces that take a very long time. And so those organisms that were fossilized at the top of the mountain, at one point in time, that top of the mountain was actually down underwater where those organisms lived, so they were very old. So in this picture, I'm just showing some of those fossils, those shells that he had found at the top of the mountain. So again, Darwin concluded that these areas were once underwater, but due to very slow changes in the surface of the earth, the mountains were lifting up. So we look at biogeography. This is the study of range and the geographic distribution of life forms on Earth. So in South America, Darwin did not find rabbits, but he did find the Patagonian hare. This hare lived in the same habitat and had similar characteristics, and the question was why? Why did this Patagonian hare basically occupy this space that we would normally find rabbits? So something had driven this organism to pick up the same, or to adapt to have the same characteristics that a rabbit has in order to be successful in that same type of habitat. So which came first? Did the Patagonian hare develop similar structures as the rabbit due to the same environment? Or did the Patagonian hare and the rabbit have a common ancestor? So these are questions that we were trying to answer. We also noticed that Darwin's famous for his tortoises and his finches from the Galapagos Islands, and we'll talk about those further as we move through the chapter. Now, when we talk about the Galapagos Islands, the Galapagos Islands are fairly new when we talk about how old the Earth is. They're only about 5 million years old. They're caused from a volcanic island chain. So what we notice is here we're going to have our primary succession, and we're going to look at the organisms that we found on those particular islands. And he concluded that the finches, because he noticed he had all of these different types of finches, and we can see them here, that they're very similar to each other except for a few characteristics. Therefore, they must have come from a common ancestor. The beaks on the finches were modified to allow these birds to use different food resources. And remember, we talked about resource partitioning. So if the different structures on these beaks allow them to utilize different areas for food, then they would be more successful. And of course, then their offspring would have that same adaptation, that same characteristic that allows them to eat leaves or fruit or grubs. And this allows for more niches to be occupied, and this is commonly referred to as adaptive radiation. So when we talk about evolution by natural selection, because that is the mechanism that Darwin gave us. Again, we had all this proof and all these pieces of information that kind of led us to evolution, but we didn't have the mechanism. So we have Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. They independently proposed the theory of natural selection. A lot of people don't know much about Alfred Wallace, and in fact, Alfred Wallace was really kind of forced Darwin's hand into publish. He has quite an extensive book, his book, The Origin of Species, but he really didn't want to publish it. That was really hanging yourself out there since, and it's still a hot topic to this day, evolution versus creationism. So he literally had instructions for his wife to publish the book if he was to die, but he had no intentions of publishing it until we talk about Henslow, his friend. John Henslow had read Alfred Wallace's paper, which was basically the same thing Darwin was proposing, and he pressured Charles into publishing. He said, "You need to get this out." So they published together So like I said, we know Darwin's publication, The Origin of Species. We generally talk about Darwin and natural selection. That is the mechanism. It suggests that individuals that are more fit for their environment will be more successful and pass those traits on to their offspring. Fitness does not mean that that particular organism can do more push-ups or sit-ups. What we're saying is that they're more successful in that environment and that they can reproduce more offspring, and that offspring is also going to be successful. It doesn't do you any good to have offspring that just are going to die and not, again, pass on those characteristics through heredity. So, since Darwin's book, and again, Darwin had so many more examples than Alfred Wallace, we tend to refer to natural selection being Charles Darwin's theory, but in actuality, both of them duly get credit. This ends the flip presentation for 17.1, and for most of 17.2, I want to readdress and talk a little bit more about natural selection in class, and we'll pick up and work on that on Friday.